Well, hello everybody, I'm Gary from Lantana Removal Queensland, 0449 986 880. So it appears that some of our efforts have been rewarded, that the Prime Minister has appointed somebody to head up the biosecurity and to, sounds like, get a little bit more serious about these things. But what I wanted to give you from here is I've had more correspondence with the Brisbane City Council, in which they say that they do take things seriously, although there's never been any to get us in to go through the different areas and map out the different infestations and then work out and formulate measures to meet their obligations, their biosecurity obligations, which defers back to they're not ever going to change their path, any of the councils, until the public opinion changes their path and their thinking, and that won't change until we change federal governments and state governments. The council relies on the fact, from the first time that we talked to them 12 months ago on these issues and started pushing these things, they say that the state government, federal government changed the ruling on Lantana to be low risk. Okay, now nobody has put on the table where this low risk came from, and nobody is willing to. It's the same way that the councils are not willing to say what sections of the state are written off and what sections aren't. But when you have proper correspondence with the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy, okay, and Biosecurity, DAF and DPI, you start to get the picture that they're operating outside of the law by not stopping Lantana from being released to the environment. Okay, the government says that they have to. So let's just have a quick look at this here and work out some mathematics, okay? Because the councils are relying on the fact that they say that the state government changed the classification to be low risk. Okay, so Dundas itself, where I've shown you that film footage and whatnot, adds up to about 50,000 acres, okay, of infestation, and that's nothing in this country by scale of those things. So 50,000 acres, if we had a cost per acre of $2,000 an acre, ends up being a $100 million problem. Okay. So are we getting any of that side of those things? So 50,000 acres by $2,000 an acre comes out a $100 million problem. So in Australia, they say, right, that we have a 10 million hectare problem. Okay, 10 million hectares ends up being 25 million acres. Okay, 25 million acres at $3,000 an acre, because some of that land is very steep, and 3,000 won't be the top price, and the other one won't necessarily be that mid-range price. So we're taking an average through there, but that ends up being a $75 billion problem. That's today. That's not next month. That's not next year. That's today at those rates, and those rates overall would be very, very light on. So that's a $75 billion problem across most of our eastern coast and some other states. And your Prime Minister tells you, don't worry about it, it's not a problem. We give $500 million almost to our mates at the Barrier Reef, and we got no money for Lantana. This is Lantana we're talking about here. This isn't the 32 weeds, this is one of 32 weeds. And every council, when these subjects come up, Brisbane City Council are one of the specialists at it, but they all do it, say that Lantana's nothing on the list of some of the weeds that are coming to us. They're not here yet, but when they do get here, they are going to be far worse than Lantana. Yeah, but hold on a minute. It's low risk according to your state government, but nobody will tell you who said that, who came up with it. Okay? At that level, it's a $75 billion problem. I don't consider $75 billion as to be chump change or a minor issue. Now that doesn't factor in anything of the growth rates of the materials. it hasn't factored in anything of what it costs next year and the year after, because it's a cascading thing. Okay, 400 plants come off one single plant per year, and that's on the low scale. Okay, so you start doing the mathematics on what the growth expenditure of this material is, and you start to get this figure is just insane on a yearly figure, because on the high end, where those plants are in the watercourses and in those other areas of high importance, then those figures go to 3,600 plants for each individual plant. These are their figures. They're not my figures making this stuff up and coming to it from you. These figures actually come from their book. Their book. Okay? It's not my making figures up. Their book says that it's 25% in bad areas, and it's I'm just escalating on the low side of that scale too at 3,600 plants per plant. Okay, because I've only allowed 6 times a year and just a 50% expansion rate. Okay, but it doesn't matter how you want to do that mathematics of their book and of those things, it still comes back to being an absolutely insane problem. So when you have a look at this video that I'm going to splice, I'm Gary from Lantana Removal, Queensland. So we're just up near Mount Glorious, just doing some filming. It's winter time up here. So basically this is what a lot of this stuff looks like, this lantana through these areas here. So you get such a big runoff from the road surfaces and how steep they are pouring down through these areas, just channeling the water through these plants. And that's what happens. The plants end up down in the bottom of the water courses, and then the birds bring them up to the tops of the mountains up in these sections, and then you can see how the water runs down through these channels through there and feeds these plants, and then they just propagate further and further downstream down the hillsides. And that's one of the biggest things that we find is very difficult to get the education program into the government situations, that they start to take this stuff very seriously, because you cannot leave this material sitting on the sides of roads where it's getting unlimited water pouring off surfaces like that straight down into areas that it just is propagating at the levels that it's propagating. It's such a detrimental material, this stuff, and there's so many millions and millions of plants involved that it just creates an enormous problem. And once they're at the top of the hills here now, from where they were down at the watercourses, it allows millions of plants to propagate at these points, and it just increases the infestation rates like you would not believe, to be able to do that. And yet it's not that hard for us to get in there and get those things cleaned out of those areas. You know, you see the way the water's all channeled down through these sections, down through these drains, and then what's sitting at the end of it? All the lantana just soaking all that water up and then propagating and spreading downhill. It's the greatest increase of the material in those environments. Now, the steepness of the terrain ends up meaning that really, what are they going to do here? Are they going to spend any money on it? Not really. But you can't let it get to these stages where it is on these areas. And such large old plants have been here for such a very long time. So you can't hide from it. At one level or another, something has to be done, or else the propagation rates are just going to keep increasing exponentially on that basis. And it's a frightening concept when you actually do the mathematics of how much material is in these areas and how high the terrain is, because that gives it the speed of movement, you know. And you've even got cactus, prickly pear growing up here as well. Look at it all down through there. So, you know, that's what we're trying to get public opinion for, because this is a national park, for goodness sake. You can't allow this sort of stuff to happen in national parks. It's just terrible. But anyway, that's what we have, so I just thought I'd share that with you, and we'll continue on with our filming. In here, this video was shot up at Mount Glorious, and it shows the fall and the shape of the roadway there, feeding those plants at the ends of the gutters. Now that just is everywhere across our country. That particular spot would be at least 5 kilometres from the base down in those creeks where you see that at Dundas, okay? So that's feeding that 5 kilometres all the way down into those watercourses at Dundas. And this is right across our country. That's not special there. So what we have, when you look at why I am so trying to get this information out. So say this is a watercourse. This is Dundas here, this is the watercourse there. These plants really flourish around those watercourses, okay? So they have that high volume output, but it's not the high volume output that you want to really worry about. They're dropping seeds at those enormous rates, and then the birds are picking these seeds up and they're flying them up here. So this is the elevation, okay? So this is just considering they're flying it back up Mount Glorious, and they stop halfway, let's say. So now you have a zone of influence all the way back to here, okay? That zone of influence, once the water's pushing it, that zone of influence fills in this gap between here, and you have a continuous mat of material up to here. And the volume of output is much, much higher, because the plants start to create their own micro climate, okay? And the more that they hang around places like Mount Glorious and the high sections of national parks, the more we have rainforests and very high humidity and rain output, water access. It generates 3,600 per plant, okay, increase. But then this doesn't really work like this, okay? That's a two-dimensional view of that type of thing, when really in most national park situations and high elevation situations, you're actually looking more at a situation like that. So you've got a ridge line through here, and then you've got hips, so to speak, coming off there of lower country, okay? So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different zones of influence. And let's say our birds put the infestation across this line here, which they have. They have everywhere that we look in these things. They've put it along those lines there. From there, the spread of this material down these surfaces end up being escalated exponentially, okay? The growth rate and the change in that is enormous. And then on these ridge lines, these are separate ridge lines to those ridge lines, they pretty much work exactly the same way, that then you have a tributary come off there, because they never come all the way down. Then you have falling three-dimensional watercourses. Everywhere this material has access to those watercourses is exponentially exploding the growth rate of the material. And this is why I had to bring this to your attention, okay? All of the national parks and wildlife people have known this has been happening forever. Okay, those plants in those areas aren't just brand new plants, and the expansion rate is enormous, okay? But what happens with these plants is they keep dropping their seeds at their base of the plant, okay? And while those seeds are around the base of that plant, under the leaf litter that the plant itself has dropped, they're dormant, okay? They don't shoot there. I've 40 years of experience of actually operating on these slopes, on doing this work, okay? I have knowledge that nobody else in this country has. These seeds remain dormant around the plants until we get a really big system, rain system, and then it hits all these seeds and it blows all these seeds out and disperses it even further across those plains, okay? And because now we have a much bigger dispersal of, say, out like this, of this main area, okay, because the plants that are here along these areas will suppress the seeds that come down there. But some of these seeds remain viable, they say in their books, up to 8 years, okay? 4 to 8 years, 10 years, 11 years, there's all sorts of figures being thrown around by them. But what I do know for a fact is where I annihilate Lantana on these steep surfaces, okay, the Lantana doesn't come back, okay? So the seedbed is not here. When the scientists and the councils and the state and federal government got together and they did do some work 20 years ago on this stuff, they worked down here on the flats here and they annihilated the plant, and then the plant came back. And the scientists went, oh, well, it has to be a 4-year, a 10-year, an 11-year seedbed. They weren't fighting the seedbed here, they were fighting the seedbed from here. Okay, so the government itself says in the book, and says blanketly, we won't go after this material in these areas here. Right? They won't do that because it's too costly to them. Okay? But you will never do any good in this area here while these infestations are in place up in these areas here. You will never do any good. It's a fact of law. Okay? So that's where we have these problems. They just don't see the problem there. These seeds that come down here and then end up under the old plants that on these areas won't seed. They don't come up unless you take these plants off, right? And then the influence of suppressing the that germination in the eleopathic way that Lantana works suddenly germinates those seeds. But that's where Lantana has an Achilles heel. Okay, you've got 12 whole months before the plants that you removed, right, and the new plants that take their place, before those plants become productive. Okay, so there should be no excuse why somebody says to you, we can't eradicate these plants there. Okay, it's the way that they've tried to do this work that they've failed, and they've failed because they don't have any knowledge about these plants. And I say that quite openly. Those books are just a ridiculous proof that they didn't know. The other proof is that we have doubled this figure from 5 million hectares to 10 million plus hectares in 10 years. That's a living proof that the people in charge of this are clueless as to what is going on with this plant. Okay? But how did your government, your state government, secretly change those laws to turn their back on this plant? They did it by getting organisations together which are called not-for-profit organisations. They're Worldwide Wildlife Fund, they're, Land Care, they're Ag Force, they're other groups that get grants from the government. They're all not-for-profit organisations. Then they put all those not-for-profit organisations together and they polled them and said, so what do you think we ought to do as bush regenerators, because they give them fancy tags, as bush regenerators, what do you reckon we should do? How do you reckon we should tackle this? And they all got together and they said, well, to be honest, we've lost control of it. We've given up. That came directly from the Department of Natural Resources, Mines and Energy. That when the government declassified Lantana and other weeds, okay, they did that because they lost control of it. So they use fancy words like it's now naturalised, okay? Naturalised means that they now consider it to be a part of the landscape because they don't have any skills in eradicating Lantana. If you give me an acre of Lantana, or you give me 10 acres of Lantana, or you give me 1,000 acres, or you give me 10,000 acres of Lantana, okay, when I eradicate the 1 acre of Lantana, and I eradicate it, it's gone, it's dead, it's finished, it doesn't come back, it's out of there. The principles are no different whether you scale it at 1 acre or you scale it at 100,000 acres or 1,000,000 acres. It does not change the principles involved. Okay? The problem is that the governments don't have any guts and fortitude and stamina to actually bother to do anything about these materials. So they turned their back on you. Your prime ministers, okay, your federal government, your state government, and your councils. Your councils are one of the worst, because what the councils did in this system here, they told all of the average people around the country that it's now low risk. It's now not noxious anymore. Now, they've used those words. It's in writing in the documents that they have sent me over this period of time of corresponding. Okay, they've told me in writing that they've ceased all operations in Lantana. Okay, they're not using and doing any operations in Lantana through Brisbane City Council, through the Moreton Bay Regional Council. They will pick and choose the places that they will fight, and they will decide whether or not they'll defend your living areas or where you live. Okay. Now, that all comes about because they keep going back and saying, well, the state government has said that it's now low risk and we don't have to worry about it. But that was never there before in the Biosecurity Act, okay? But eradication was taken out of the Biosecurity Act, but what was left in there was actually that you cannot release this material to the environment. Thank goodness somebody had some guts and cared about our children enough to leave that clause in the Biosecurity Act. And your councils, who are the worst of these criminals, every single one of them, right the way through, are doing exactly the same thing, altering laws to cover their tracks and then prosecuting citizens. They are misleading the courts when they say to the courts that that you are breaking the law by having a noxious material on your land that needs to be cleaned up, and if you're not going to clean it up, they'll come in and clean it up themselves and then bill you for the cost of that. And people get really, really frightened because they know how badly the costs are with the councils. You wouldn't contract them to do anything. So how does $75 million become low risk, especially with the expansion rates at either 400 plants for every plant or 3,600 for every plant? How does it get to be low risk? They all just put it on the too hard basket and said, you know, let's let some other government deal with this later down the track when when it can't be kept under the carpet anymore. You know, at what point did they expect that the lid would be blown off it? Who knows? It doesn't really matter, because this is a 30-year-old problem. The councils have been doing this for 30 years and then telling you, the public, that you don't need to worry about it, don't worry about it because we're not worrying about it. Lantana's everywhere now. The state and federal government say that Lantana's everywhere now. We're just going to turn our back on it. You're going to turn your back on those growth rates. Those growth rates are their growth rates in their books. Somebody has been telling you and me porky pies for a very long time, and this is your children's and my children's future that's being flushed down the toilet here by your Prime Minister and by your Premiers. And I've been writing to these people for 12 months now, okay, and I'm still yet to hear anything that's of any value, or to have them contact me and start to organise how we're going to get this stuff under control. This isn't something you can turn your back on. This is a cancer that keeps expanding, and they've already let it get to this stage. This is nothing. That expansion rate on this material, when you start counting plants, is astronomical. The fact that these plants now occupy these terrains for thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometres, because nearly every mountain range within those national parks almost links to the next national park as it goes up the line. Okay, on one side of those ranges, which we would call the dividing range, Great Dividing Range, okay, we have what? Yeah, we have us. Now we have medium farms, small farms on these sides of the ranges. Okay, that would be Lockyer Valley, that would be all through those areas down through into New South Wales. And on the other side of that, we have some of our Great Plains and a lot of our cattle country, okay, and our big grain cattle, big grain areas. And this material owns that landscape in between those two ecosystems and owns them outright. Now, I've asked the national parks to give me access to those national parks to map and identify and to quantify the levels of the infestations. Now, you'd probably be laughing now because, yes, I got to please explain why do I want to get in there and why do I want to do that. And I wrote that back immediately. The ink didn't even cool on their email, and I answered it and said, this is why, this is what I'm looking at, and I have to get people, the general public, to educate the general public to care to understand why $75 billion problem is a problem rather than low risk. Because our government spent all of their time and all of their effort telling us that this is not a problem. Our councils told everybody it's not a problem. Now, let me just give you a little very important piece of advice here, okay? Lantana is a real problem. It's not hard to kill, so if you don't have it on your property, for God's sake, defend your property. Okay, it shows up there, take it out. You don't have to panic. You've got 12 months from when the plant establishes itself to when it can actually breed. It's like God's little joke on us that we've actually got a window. If we get off our backsides and we go get that plant, it's not even a difficult plant to kill. Forget your poisons. Do not listen to your government. They are so in cahoots with the chemical manufacturers. It's just a disgrace. If you poison that ecosystem, you weaken the ecosystem beneath it. You kill all of the subsoil life, and there's nothing to support your new growth that will outcompete the weed. Okay, so for God's sake, throw that garbage out the window where it belongs. You find in this book, the 90% of their garbage in this book is focused on what chemical systems you can use to eradicate the material. It's an obscenity. It's an absolute obscenity, and it shows exactly where the government's loyalties lie. It's not with the people of the nation, it's actually with the chemical companies. You don't weaken the host. It would be like weakening you while you're suffering from cancer. It's just insanity. How can that possibly work? Nobody in their right mind goes, oh, this is a good idea, let's do this. They themselves say, if you have a really healthy ecosystem, if you boost your ecosystem by putting a lot of mulch and creating a much more vibrant flora, then you won't have the problems of these things infesting your lands and cutting into your lands. So anyway, just get the plant out of there. You don't have to dig it out all the way and chase the roots. Yank his head off and pull him out, and if he shows back up, pull him out again. You will not have to do it more than twice, okay? Their stores are in there under subsoil, so they don't have enough stores there to keep regenerating. So once you pull the plant out, you're done for that plant, okay? And they won't, or they shouldn't, infest you in that manner unless you've got a lot of infestation up above you, okay? And that's where we all have to go back to the councils and sack them all. Sack every council from the Daintree to the bottom of New South Wales. Sacked a lot of them. Get rid of every person that's in the councillors' roles and in the mayors. Sacked a lot of them. Right through. They're gone. They caused this, and they've been in cahoots with the state government causing it all the way through this. And they're not spending any money on coming to us and going, okay, let's put some procedures in place and let's get after this material before $75 billion, right? In the next 10 years, they'll quadruple it. That will be a $300 billion problem in 10 years' time. It's low risk. Don't worry about it, guys. Your council's been telling you that for 20 years. Everybody coming to me from the councils has been saying, we've been going to the councils and they've been saying it's not toxic, we don't have to worry about it, our council staff have it growing on their lands, it's not a problem. You've seen how every part of this is laid out. You've seen the film footage showing you it is a real serious problem. And that Dundas is nothing to what the 10 million hectares looks like. Our government has spent a fortune and a hell of a lot of hassle to try and brainwash and mislead the general public. I consistently have people come to me and say, why don't you poison the plant and then climb under the plant and plant a tree in the middle of that plant, and then you outcompete that. Trees are not the answer here. Grass is the answer here, right? By all means, plant the grass out and then plant trees into that grass and let its succession run, okay? So the forestry takes over eventually, but in the short term, your grasses fill that void between there. We need to start going back to many more manure crops, green manure crops that we plough in or we trample in, right, through cattle, through different mechanisms to build those soil healths and the subsoil biology, right, and then trample them back in, mow them back in. We can use a lot of different ways to do that, but that brings the soil health up and it will stop these plants from getting that huge ongoing thing. So that's so important. Get away from the chemicals. Get away from all of those biological controls. There has never been one successful biological control that did not have massive side effects. Look at the cane toads. Look at every other mechanism that they used as a biological control. There never will be a single scientific, specific biological control ever in our history, because nature does not work that way. Our own scientists spent a fortune at CSIRO building a completely sterile Lantana plant to release back to the nursery industry. When they released that, and they spent a fortune creating it through their genetics and all the rest of the garbage that went on, and in one season, 1 year, nature not only unsterilized it, but it cloned it back to the original strain of Lantana in the country. This is what we're dealing with. And our government spends enormous amounts of money playing those games and telling you that they've got some really good things in the mix. There's some really good new science coming up. There's some really good and exciting, looking like it'll be a good thing, things about to be released. Rusts and biological controls. It's all garbage. Even if there was something that they were working on, we should be doing huge mechanical interventions until there is another interventional option that is worthwhile. The key things that we've got to do, we've got to get into this high country and get this material out of those high countries, out of those national parks and areas like that, and the high countries and the watercourses. That has to be our priority. It's no good going down here into the low country and just keep fighting the same battle and pouring huge amounts of money into this. We have to get these things solved here, okay? Anyway, I'm Gary. I'm going to cut this into a few different videos because there's a lot more specific information about what you should do and how you should do it. So please come back and watch the next video, okay, part 2. So that will have more information about our government and about these different ways of dealing with these materials and why we need to care, because it's a very important problem. Remember, I'm Gary from Lantana Removal Queensland, and I'm the only one who's brought you all of this information. The government has spent all of their efforts to suppress this information, to set up with the councils to mislead people into not doing anything about these things, to calling it low risk. So it's very important that you share this information as broadly and widely as you possibly can to get as many people to understand and start asking the questions of your Prime Minister. Start asking the questions of your ministers and your premiers of the states. Because these people, until you start to ask the questions, they don't care. I'm just one person out there making their lives very uncomfortable, and I'm being very successful at it. But until you guys all back it up, and you stand up for your children's future or their children's future, this is a catastrophe at $75 billion now. Not next year, not the year after. These people have put us in such a position that we need to start acting now and deal with these issues now. Anyway, once again, I'm Gary from Lantana Removal Queensland, 0449 986 880. Please look all this information up for yourself, make your own decisions, go and have a look at the Lantana or look at my videos where the Lantana is, and we'll talk again soon. I'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.